Well, since men and women started exchanging goods and services, we've all been concerned to be sure what we're getting in exchange is good quality. Tonight, I'm going to try and weave together some of the customs and roles I've seen across the city and how they relate to ensuring quality. In my working life, I've seen management of quality develop from quality control, and then we had the thoughts of Edward Deming. Those of you who've been around a while might remember DEFSTAN 0521, which preceded then the British standard, and then ISO 9001, and then came Toyota Way, and in automotive world, we now have TS 16949, which we're going for. Lots of jargon and numbers, but enough of that. Since their formation, liveries have been concerned about the quality of goods and the protection of their reputations. However, being a liveryman seems to have been a little hazardous, with cases of poisonings, stabbings, under-fermented beer, off meat, and fish. For example, our modern habit of chinking glasses, as we say cheers, is the remnant of a much older practice of slurping a slug of your drink into your drinking partner's tankard. If your partner then refused to drink your health, you might suspect a little poison in there. And have you read through the ceremony of the loving cup? Of course, you'll realize that the reason there is a lid is not to keep the wine safe, it's to occupy the sword hand of your neighbor to make sure they can't stab you, as your other neighbor literally protects your back. In pre-COVID days, we were all expected to attend Guildhall on Midsummer's Day to elect the sheriffs for the ensuing year. And those of you that have attended will know at the same time, and as I recall this, it's always ladies in exceptionally large hats invite us to vote for some of the other positions. These include 2 bridge masters and 4 Elconners. And my beadle, when I was master upholder, was also an Elconner. So what's the job of an Elconner and how do they do it? Well, it's perhaps the most coveted job in London. They test the quality of ales, and they've been doing it since Roman times. However, the earliest reference I found to the role was in 1152, when the assize of ale and bread in London set the price for 2 gallons of ale at 1 penny. Not bad. I guess we wish we could have that now. In 1371, the assize ruled that no hostelier or herberger, unless he be a common brewer, shall sell ale to guests, and then at only 2 pence a gallon. At the same time, they were checking the correct measures and that the beer was not watered down. A few years later, in 1386, perhaps Chaucer witnessed an incident in the brew house kept by John at the Cook on the Hop in Crotched Friars, or Crotched Friars as it was spelt then, where I can imagine a rather inebriated Thomas Stokes, having spent his last penny, decided to try his luck and demanded a free pint to test the King's Ale as the King's Elconner. John, the landlord, was not taken in, and for his impudence, Thomas was put in the stocks at Cornhill. It doesn't record what was thrown at him or poured over him, but maybe a few pints of stale beer. If we leap forward about 100 years, on the 24th of September 1493, there's some wonderful records around, the good men of the Mystery of Beer Brewers came before the mayor and aldermen, petitioning for the appointment of 2 wardens and 6 to 8 honest men to be rulers and governors. At the same time, these rulers, together with an Elconner, should have the right to search hops and grain and survey the vessels used for beer. Guildhall records show it was some 50 years later that Common Hall decided that 2 Elconners should be elected on the same day as sheriffs and chamberlain. Across the river, in the Guildhall Manor of Southwark, they appointed their own Elconner. How they get along with the city Elconners, who claim to control all trade within 1 mile of the city, I don't know, but somehow they got away with it. And as you can read from this charge, their Elconner in Southwark, at least, his remit included the bread. I can see the beginnings of the modern environmental health department here. Perhaps one of the best known Elconners in modern times is past master constructor and former Sheriff Christine Rigdon, seen here in Vintners Hall. So what's going on? As We see the pictures are really the ritual as it's evolved today. And I don't know how much they've been drinking, but as you see at the top and the middle picture, they tend to pour their beer onto the seats rather than drinking it. Why so? There's some debate about the historical accuracy of this, but today the ale conner dons a pair of leather trousers, pours the ale onto a wooden seat and sits in it for 10 minutes and then stands up. Now, some people say the seat should stick to the ale conner and others say it should not. And even if you ask two ale conners, you get a different answer. Personally, I apply an engineering thought process to this. The idea is to test to see if the ale is fit to drink. And that means, has it got enough alcohol in it to clear or kill all the bugs that might be in the water? So if it's doing that, that means the sugar should have disappeared and therefore it shouldn't stick. Other people might have a different view. And of course, at the time, small beer was what everybody drank instead of water. If I return to my friends in the Guildhall Manor of Southwark, they also have a flesh taster or flesher. And here you can see the tools of the trade, made from pewter, and I think the knife looks to me rather blunt, but I'm told it works. And you also see here their charge, which is to ensure there's no carrion or unwholesome flesh sold. Back in the city, of course, the responsibilities of the flesher were the remit of the Butchers' Company. The Butchers' Guild were the direct predecessors of the present company and granted the right to regulate the trade in 1331. Their charter, granted by James I in 1605, gave the butchers the jurisdiction to control the trade within the City of London and 1 mile outside, as most of the regulations seem to have covered. And thus they were the meat inspectors for Smithfield, and were doing this until Smithfield moved. Likewise, the Fishmongers' Company also look after their trade. Their ordinances, containing full and detailed provisions for the regulation of the London fish trade, were formally approved in 1279. In 1439, in the presence of the Lord Mayor and Aldermen, the office of Assayer of Oysters and Mussels at Billingsgate and Queenhithe was granted to John Leet for life. It doesn't say how long he lived. I expect he enjoyed a few free oysters in that time. Today, of course, the fishmongers manage the Master Fishmonger Standard, which is a professional certification scheme. And they continue to control the quality of fish at Billingsgate, as you can see here, the fish inspector wearing their coat of arms. Turning to my mother company, the patent rolls, that is the official records of the court, show that the king was petitioned in 1346 for the authority to seize poor quality goods from France and overseas, perhaps stuffed with wool mixed with animal hair. Should I be asking the Boris whether he was going to reinstate this? In 1688, Charles II granted the upholds a new charter and lists the things that shouldn't be in mattresses. Amongst them were burnt feathers, rotten matter, soap ashes, quills, pigeon feathers, and green sticks, none of which sounds very conducive to a good night's sleep. The charter said that 3 or more wardens and assistants should together search out goods, tear them to pieces, or throw them into the fire. I've read, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find the original reference, which is, I think, in the closed City Livery Club library, of an incident when this took place. The stock of an upholder was dragged out into the street and burned. However, it seems to be a bit of an internecine squabble, as 3 years later the victim had become the master upholder. Quality standards change, obviously. Thinking of fights brings me to the armourers and braziers, another livery controlling their craft. They first emerged in 1322, when 26 armourers and helmet makers were granted the right to oversee standards in the making of armour and helmets in the City of London. In times of peace, the company diversified into brass, making that, and when armour went out of use for restoration, they turned fully to their secondaries trade. However, one company remained making swords in London until 2005, when the distinguished sword maker, Wilkinson Sword, who'd been established for over 200 years, ceased trading as sword makers. Our own engineers' company sword, presented in 1984, was made by them. Sorry, this is rather a small picture, but the best I found. And as a 22-year-old apprentice in the Directorate of Defence Quality Assurance, I was sent out to audit Wilkinson Sword to the newly established DESTAN 0524 quality standards. In those days, there were 3 levels: 0529 for final inspection, 0524 for manufacturing, and 0521 for design and manufacture. Apparently, Wilkinson Sword didn't qualify for design, so I was there to audit them to see if they knew how to make swords and become a registered supplier to the MOD. It seems somebody thought a 22-year-old apprentice would know better than their history of making swords for over 200 years, since 1884. Just as a small diversion, thinking of swords, I, in my livery career, also had the opportunity to sit in HMS Drake in the wardroom mess there, within touching distance of Sir Francis Drake's sword. You get in some wonderful places in livery. I'm sure, Master, you've had some good experiences too in the last year, although perhaps more online than in the real world, as it were. Similar to the armourers are the gun makers, incorporated by a Royal Charter in 1637 to promote and regulate gun making. And their charter defined a role that they still play today, creating a proof mark. The mark is stamped on guns that meet the statutory safety requirements, and only the company can do it. It's illegal, as I'm sure you know, to sell a gun without a recognised proof mark. And the company still has the power to search for unproved guns and seize them. And in addition to testing guns in their proof house, as you see in the top corner here, a picture of someone firing a gun into what they call the snail, which captures the shot. The proof master and proof personnel travelled out to perform proof on guns that would be difficult to bring to London. You may realise that the city has 40 livery halls, the 41st being the gun makers who weren't allowed actually into London because of the amount of noise they made. Thinking of the howitzer you see here, I was involved in a rather more serious quality problem relating to this. Back when I was a student, the chief metallurgist at the Ordnance Factory in Nottingham knew he had a problem, so he thought he'd solve it by taking on a number of MOD students and putting them in different parts of the factory. Most were on different parts of the process and given different parts of the problem. I guess he was trying to make sure nobody actually put the whole picture together. I was on a different scheme and able to move around the factory, and I actually put my finger on the problem without realising it when I asked how it was the guns were being released, because I'd been in the metallurgy laboratory and seen every gun was failing the test there. And I knew from another student too the root cause, that a number of the elements in the heating furnace weren't working. I also saw the chief metallurgist in his office with his Tipex. It was only when it came out in the news that later I realised what I'd seen. And actually, as a student, you don't believe it, so you never say it out loud. If I'd said what I'd seen, that would probably stop 6 months worth of guns that had to be recalled being produced. Staying with metal trades, the very word used for this company tells you of its livery roots. In exactly 1300, Edward I instructed the goldsmiths to go from shop to shop to assay work and apply the leopard's head mark. By 1365, Edward III established the maker's mark required alongside the leopard's head. And then 100 years or so later, in 1478, the common assayer was employed under the supervision of the touch warden. The touch warden changed every year, and originally the year mark in hallmarking was actually the warden's initials. Master, do you want to go do that? Because the assayer, of course, was working in the goldsmith's hall, these became known as hallmarks. From time to time, the hallmarks have changed, as you can see across the bottom of this slide here, mainly to make it difficult for forgers, and not always were these changes announced in advance. Also on this slide are the reference Troy marks, which I understand are kept in the hall and not at National Physical Laboratory. I think Isabel's in there. She can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what the goldsmiths have told me. The trial of the picks is another activity the goldsmiths carried out every year, and perhaps a good example of random sampling and even statistical process control that's been going on since 1282. The ceremony involves some people with some wonderful titles. We have the Chancellor of the Exchequer or his representative, the Royal Mint, their representative, the Queen's Remembrancer, and some freemen, and the Master Wardens and some freemen from the company. It's the Queen's Remembrancer, not the city's Remembrancer. That's a different role. During the course of the year, the Royal Mint puts aside 1 in every 5,000 of the minted coins worth more than 10p, and 1 in every 20,000 of those worth less. And these are placed into cylindrical wooden boxes with lids, called the picks. Then in February each year, there's a ceremony where the picks are brought to Goldsmiths Hall and opened. Each juror picks out 1 coin at random, and these coins are then sent to the assay office to check for markings, dimensions, and material composition. In checking the material composition, they use the assay plates, and what you see here is an example of one of them. The assay plates are like this, are cut into random shapes. So half is then retained at Goldsmiths Hall and half is sent to the Royal Mint. So they can join them back up again to prove they are the genuine article. 3 months after the initial meeting, the trial reconvenes, and it's called a trial as we have a jury. And the verdict of the assay office is provided to the jurors, read aloud by the clerk to the goldsmiths on the instruction of their senior master and the Queen's Remembrancer. After that, I'm sure they all enjoy a good glass of wine, which brings me back to alcohol and perhaps the vintners. They have quite a modern chart you see here, which in 1972 authorised the company to set up the Wine Standards Board, to which the government delegates its certain responsibilities for enforcing EU wine laws. That Wine Standards Board transferred to the Food Standards Agency in 2006, and the company then began to be an association of the Wine and Spirits Association and WISIT, Wine and Spirits Education Trust, who also run some good tasting sessions if anybody wants. And now, just before I finish, I should acknowledge a few of my good friends around the livery and the city who helped me with this, and particularly 1 or 2 clerks who've given me permission to use their material that I have here. So thank you very much.